Captain, 23 years wearing a badge, 2 commendations for bravery, 1 bullet that changed the rest of my life. And somehow none of that prepared me for pulling into my own driveway and finding a pile of broken concrete where my garage had been standing just 48 hours earlier. People always ask me if that was the angriest day of my life, but honestly, anger wasn't the first thing I felt. It was confusion, the kind that makes you stare at something your brain refuses to process. I actually parked in the street because I thought I had the wrong house. Then I noticed my mailbox, my wife's flower beds, the old maple tree we'd planted 10 years earlier. And that's when my stomach dropped. My name is Daniel Mercer. I retired as a police lieutenant from the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department after an on-duty shooting left my left leg permanently damaged. I can still walk short distances with a brace, but most days I rely on a wheelchair, especially around the house. After months of rehab, the Department of Veterans Affairs approved modifications that finally gave me back a piece of my independence. We rebuilt the garage with wheelchair access, reinforced flooring for my mobility van, an overhead transfer lift, adjustable workbenches where I could still restore old fishing reels, and custom ramps that let me get from my vehicle into the house without asking my wife for help every single time. That garage wasn't just another home improvement project. It represented every painful hour of physical therapy, every setback, every night I wondered if I'd ever feel useful again. My wife Emily kept reminding me, "It's not just a garage, Dan. It's your freedom." She knew because she'd watched me struggle after the shooting. She also happened to be one of the best disability rights attorneys in Nevada, though I didn't think much about that at the time. I figured we'd finally reached the chapter where life slowed down a little. Looking back now, I should have recognized the warning signs months earlier. Our HOA vice president, Patricia Holloway, had been making my life difficult ever since construction started. It wasn't even personal at first. She simply loved reminding everyone that she controlled the neighborhood. If somebody painted their shutters the wrong shade of gray, she'd appear with violation notices before the paint dried. If kids left bicycles on the sidewalk for an hour, she'd post pictures in the community Facebook group with passive-aggressive captions about declining property values. When our contractor parked his trailer in front of my house during construction, Patricia walked over carrying a binder thick enough to stop a bullet and said, "Lieutenant Mercer, rules apply equally to everyone." I smiled and showed her the temporary city permit taped inside the trailer window. She frowned, scribbled something in her notebook, then walked away without another word. That should have been the end of it. Instead, every week another complaint arrived. Wrong construction hours, unapproved materials, excessive noise, unsafe equipment. Every single accusation turned out to be false. We'd submitted architectural drawings months before construction even began. Certified mail, email confirmations, city permits, engineering approvals, even an ADA accommodation request explaining exactly why the garage had to be modified. According to the HOA bylaws, if the board failed to respond within 30 days, the application was automatically approved. They never responded. We kept copies of everything because Emily always said, "Paper wins arguments." I laughed at her habit of saving every email into labeled folders. Turns out she wasn't being paranoid. She was being prepared. 3 weeks after construction finished, I worked an overnight shift consulting on a training exercise for younger officers. It felt good putting the uniform back on even if I wasn't chasing suspects anymore. Around noon, I drove home already thinking about grabbing lunch with Emily. Instead, I found yellow caution tape blowing across my driveway, broken cinder blocks scattered like someone had dropped a bomb, twisted steel beams sticking out of shattered concrete, and my mobility lift crushed underneath a mountain of debris. My toolbox, the one my father had given me before he passed, lay split open in the dirt. I sat there without moving for what felt like forever. Then I saw a folded notice taped to my front door. It said the structure had been removed under authority of the Homeowners Association due to unauthorized exterior modifications. I actually laughed because it was too ridiculous to believe. Then I called the HOA office. Patricia answered on the second ring, like she'd been waiting all morning. "Good afternoon, Mr. Mercer," she said with that fake customer service voice. "I assume you've seen the compliance action." I asked one simple question. Who authorized destroying my garage? She calmly replied. The board enforced community standards after repeated violations. I reminded her every permit had been approved. She ignored that completely and started reading from a paragraph in the bylaws about architectural consistency. I interrupted again. Patricia, you have copies of my approvals. She sighed dramatically before saying, whether you agree or not is irrelevant. You currently owe $11,000 in fines and removal costs. I could feel my pulse pounding. You demolished accessibility equipment installed because I'm permanently disabled. She actually laughed, not loudly, just enough to make sure I heard it. Then she said something I'll never forget for the rest of my life. I don't care if you're disabled, Lieutenant. Neighborhood rules don't make exceptions for anybody. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. I looked across the broken concrete where my independence used to stand, then quietly thanked her for her time and ended the call. My hands weren't shaking because I was scared. They were shaking because somewhere deep inside, I realized Patricia Holloway had just made the biggest mistake of her entire life. Emily walked outside before I even made it into the house. She didn't ask what happened because one look at the driveway told her everything she needed to know. She stood there silently for maybe 30 seconds, taking in the crushed lift, the twisted aluminum ramp, the concrete dust covering my mobility van. Then she looked at me and asked the strangest question. Did you call Patricia? I nodded. Did she say anything about your disability? I reached in my shirt pocket, pulled out my phone, and hit play. I never intentionally recorded people because I expected them to incriminate themselves. Years in law enforcement simply taught me that memories change, but recordings don't. Patricia's voice came through the speaker as clear as if she were standing beside us. I don't care if you're disabled. Neighborhood rules don't make exceptions. Emily closed her eyes for a second, almost like she was organizing files inside her own head. Then she smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile I'd seen in court when opposing attorneys realized too late they'd walked into a trap they built themselves. Come inside, she said calmly. We're going to need the dining room table. Within an hour, every binder, every permit, every email confirmation, every certified mail receipt, every construction invoice, every inspection report we'd collected over the previous 8 months covered that table from one end to the other. Emily had labeled everything with colored tabs months earlier. At the time, I teased her for treating our garage project like a murder investigation. Now, she quietly slid documents into neat stacks while reading dates out loud. City approval, HOA submission, delivery confirmation, engineering certification, ADA accommodation request, architectural review deadline, automatic approval. Every sentence made Patricia's position weaker. Then Emily opened another folder I'd almost forgotten existed. Your recordings. I stared at the plastic case filled with flash drives. Every board meeting I'd attended. Every conversation with Patricia after she cornered me in the neighborhood. Every voicemail she'd left threatening fines. I wasn't trying to build a case against anybody back then. I simply had a habit from police work. Documentation keeps honest people honest and dishonest people nervous. Emily plugged the first drive in her laptop. We listened for nearly 4 hours. There was Patricia claiming my wheelchair ramp hurt property values. Patricia questioning whether I really needed accessibility modifications because she'd seen me stand up during a barbecue. Patricia suggesting disabled accommodations gave homeowners unfair advantages. Every recording painted the same picture. This wasn't about architecture. This wasn't about community standards. This was about one woman who couldn't stand the idea that someone might receive a legally protected accommodation she couldn't control. Around 7 that evening, Emily leaned back in her chair and quietly said, "She's not just violating HOA policy anymore. She's crossed into federal territory." The next morning, our dining room transformed into what looked like a command center. Emily filed complaints with the Department of Justice, the State Civil Rights Division, and Federal District Court. I contacted the VA because several pieces of destroyed equipment had been funded through federal disability assistance. One of my former colleagues, now working as an investigator for an insurance fraud unit, suggested something else. Send every recording to the HOA's insurance carrier. At first, I didn't understand why. Then he explained that liability insurance usually protects volunteer board members from honest mistakes, but intentional misconduct is different. If discrimination could be proven, the insurance company might refuse to defend them altogether. Emily looked at me over her reading glasses and simply said, "Let's find out." 3 days later, an adjuster named Rebecca called asking permission to review every recording, every email, every photograph, every permit. She sounded professional but cautious, like someone trying not to reveal too much over the phone. I uploaded everything that afternoon. While waiting for answers, we started digging into something else that didn't make sense. According to the demolition notice, the entire HOA board had approved removing my garage during an emergency meeting. That bothered me because I'd attended enough board meetings to know emergency votes required documentation. Emily requested copies of the meeting minutes. They arrived 5 days later. Something felt off immediately. The formatting was different. Signatures didn't match older records. Even the timestamp looked strange. One page claimed the board unanimously agreed my application had never been submitted. Emily quietly reached into another folder and pulled out the certified mail receipt signed by the HOA office almost 9 months earlier. Same address, same date, same employee's signature. "Interesting," she whispered. We contacted a former HOA administrative assistant named Karen Ellis who had resigned 6 months before. She agreed to meet us at a small coffee shop outside the neighborhood. Karen looked nervous from the second she sat down. She stirred her coffee for almost a minute before saying, "I wondered when somebody would finally ask." According to Karen, Patricia often intercepted architectural applications before they reached the review committee. If she personally disliked a project, she'd delay presenting it until the automatic approval deadline passed, then later claimed no approval had ever been granted. Karen admitted she'd argued with Patricia about it more than once before eventually quitting. Then she handed Emily a small flash drive. I copied some emails before I left because I knew someday someone would need them. That little flash drive changed everything. It contained deleted email chains showing Patricia had received every one of our permits. One message from another board member even warned her in writing that demolishing an ADA-compliant structure could expose the HOA to federal liability. Patricia replied with a single sentence, "I'll handle it before they realize what happened." Emily read that email twice before looking up at me. This isn't negligence anymore. This is intentional. Meanwhile, word spread through the neighborhood faster than I expected. People I'd barely spoken to for years started knocking on our door. An older veteran named Harold admitted Patricia had repeatedly fined him over a wheelchair lift installed for his wife before she passed away. Another family said their son's autism therapy swing had been labeled an unauthorized recreational structure. A woman recovering from breast cancer told us Patricia tried forcing her to remove temporary handrails installed after surgery. None of them had fought back because each case seemed too small on its own. Together, they formed a pattern nobody could ignore. Local television picked up the story after one of my former partners mentioned it to a reporter. Cameras appeared outside the subdivision entrance. Suddenly, Patricia stopped answering calls from residents. The HOA Facebook page disabled comments. Emergency board meetings started happening behind closed doors. Then on the 9th day, Rebecca from the insurance company called again. This time her tone sounded completely different. "Lieutenant Mercer," she said carefully, "our legal department completed its review." I glanced at Emily, who immediately stopped typing and listened. Rebecca continued. "Based on the evidence provided, particularly the recorded statements and documented communications demonstrating intentional discriminatory conduct, the carrier will be denying defense and indemnity coverage for this matter." I asked her to explain that in plain English. She took a breath before answering. "Your HOA insurance policy does not protect board members who knowingly engage in intentional discrimination or deliberate unlawful acts. They will be personally responsible for their own legal defense and any judgments entered against them." I thanked her, ended the call, and looked across the kitchen at Emily. She didn't celebrate. She simply nodded once because she already understood what that meant. Up until that moment, Patricia and the rest of the board believed the HOA's insurance policy would shield them no matter what happened. They figured even if they lost, the association would write a check and life would move on. They had no idea the safety net underneath them had just disappeared. Overnight, this stopped being a dispute about a garage. It became a question of whose retirement savings, whose home equity, whose personal bank accounts might end up paying for the consequences of one woman's arrogance. And for the first time since I found that pile of rubble in my driveway, I realized the people who had spent months trying to make me feel powerless were finally beginning to understand what real fear felt like. The next 48 hours felt almost surreal. People who had refused to return my emails for months suddenly wanted meetings. Attorneys who had once sent threatening letters now sounded strangely polite. By the morning of day 11, rumors were flying through the neighborhood that the board had spent nearly 6 straight hours arguing behind closed doors. One resident texted me, saying voices could be heard through the clubhouse walls. Another said Patricia walked out halfway through the meeting, got into her SUV, and sat in the parking lot crying before driving away. I didn't know if those stories were true, and honestly, they didn't matter anymore. The facts spoke loudly enough on their own. On day 12, the HOA's attorney called Emily directly. His confidence from earlier conversations had completely disappeared. "We're interested in discussing settlement options," he said. Emily calmly replied, "We're happy to listen, but we're not interested in pretending this never happened." She spent the next hour calculating every dollar of damage. The destroyed garage, the adaptive equipment, temporary accessibility costs, emotional distress, attorney fees, federal civil rights claims, punitive damages. The number wasn't designed to be dramatic. It reflected what years of experience told her a jury could reasonably consider after hearing the evidence. The following morning, 2 board members resigned effective immediately. According to neighbors, both insisted Patricia had assured them everything had been approved by legal counsel. Whether they truly believed her or were simply trying to distance themselves before things became even worse, I honestly can't say. What I do know is that by day 14, Patricia Holloway was removed from her position by the very people who had spent months backing her decisions without asking enough questions. Less than 24 hours later, the settlement agreement was finalized. The HOA and the remaining board members agreed to pay $285,000 covering reconstruction, replacement of every piece of adaptive equipment, attorney fees, and additional damages. Patricia, meanwhile, was left to hire her own attorney because the insurance company had already made its position painfully clear. Months later, the federal case concluded with additional conditions that permanently changed her future. She accepted restrictions preventing her from serving in any leadership position involving homeowner associations for many years, a consequence that mattered far more to her than any financial penalty, because power had always been the thing she valued most. Construction on the new garage began a few weeks afterward. This time I watched every stage with a different perspective. The new design was even better than the original. Wider access, smarter lift systems, better lighting. A workshop that actually allowed me to work comfortably again. The first afternoon I rolled into that finished garage by myself. I shut off the engine, sat there quietly, and realized something I hadn't expected. The lawsuit didn't give me my independence back. My independence had never actually belonged to Patricia or the HOA in the first place. What they destroyed was concrete, steel, and equipment. What they failed to destroy was the decision to keep standing back up, even when life had already knocked me down once before. Looking back, I don't hate Patricia. Carrying that kind of anger is exhausting. And after everything my family went through, peace turned out to be worth a lot more than revenge. But I do hope she learned something that too many people in positions of authority forget. Rules exist to protect communities, not to become weapons against the people living in them. The moment someone starts confusing power with permission, they're usually only a few bad decisions away from losing both. These days, my neighbors stop by the garage more often than they ever did before. We laugh, drink coffee, work on old projects, and every now and then someone points to the automatic lift and jokes, "That's probably the most expensive garage in the neighborhood." I usually smile and answer, "Not really. The first one was." If there's one thing this entire experience taught me, it's that documentation matters, patience matters, and treating people with dignity matters even more. Sometimes the loudest person in the room isn't the strongest. Sometimes the quiet person keeping careful records is. So now I want to ask you something. If an HOA board knowingly abuses its authority or discriminates against a homeowner, should every individual board member be held personally responsible for the consequences, or should the association itself absorb the blame? I'd genuinely like to hear where you stand, so leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you've ever dealt with an HOA, an abuse of authority, or a situation where standing your ground changed everything, share your story as well. And if you enjoy real-world stories about accountability, justice, and ordinary people refusing to back down, don't forget to like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.